When I refer to the decades of change, this is change that's sometimes good, change that's sometimes bad. So sometimes change is neither good or bad. And so when we think about these changes, so we're going to focus in on how sponsors have changed. We're going to look at a little bit about how some forms of motorsports have grown, but of course there's been a decline in a large number of racetracks, race drivers, interest in racing, and that's a little bit more recent, but some of that's just kind of the sign of the times. There's just more stuff for people to do. Others would say that it's kind of just the decline of motorsport as far as it's being a product. What I mean by that is something called the product life cycle curve. And so just like any product, whether it be a new fad, a new idea, whether it be a new restaurant, it often has that surge at the beginning. It's new. Everyone wants it. Everyone thinks that they should have it. And so motorsport definitely went through that boom period, and we can see that kind of an introduction to that growth area showcased in the product life cycle curve, which is something that you see all throughout business classes, business schools. This is just a simple idea that shows how products over time, they grow, they become quite popular, but over time they kind of are like, okay, there's then something new that comes along, and over time products, they get stale, so that they reinvent themselves. And some things actually go into decline. So the product life cycle curve, I think this also applies to motorsport over time. And so I'd say we're definitely in stage 3, in which we're in maturity, where kind of this stagnation, kind of stuck. Some areas are growing, some areas are not. Where is it going in the future? Are we going to see motorsports decline? I think it'll continue to evolve. It'll continue to change. But nonetheless, that boom period has subsided. That boom period has slowed down. Some forms of motorsport perhaps could be going through a boom period, but as a whole, if we look at motorsport in this product life cycle curve, kind of in this maturity stage. And once again, these transitions, some happen earlier, some happen later. And so in the case of Langhorne Speedway in the 1970s, it met its demise. What happened? Essentially this phase that we're going to see throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and still to this day, is the closing down of racetracks. So we had that building boom. We had that post-World War II boom. We're building racetracks everywhere. We're racing everywhere. We're racing every night. There becomes too much. There becomes oversaturation in the market. And so essentially what happens is survival of the fittest. Not every racetrack is going to survive. Not every racing series is going to survive. And so over time, we have a place like Langhorne Speedway, which is found, originally it was kind of in a rural area, but with suburbanization, building, housing subdivisions, neighborhoods start to encroach on these rural areas where a lot of these rural tracks were built. And so we have something called NIMBY, which stands for Not in My Backyard. And so this NIMBYism starts to flourish, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so you start to see the closing of tracks, especially because of the noise. Maybe it's the dirt. Maybe it's the traffic, the congestion, yada, yada, yada. Various reasons. These new homes, essentially in new subdivisions, have over time removed a lot of racing venues. Langhorne Speedway is where Jimmy Bryan, a famous race car driver from the 1950s, definitely that Steinbeck characters. And this guy always smoking a cigar, wearing a t-shirt. I mean, look how close the tire is to his right shoulder. So these guys, I mean, they're risking their lives. Their neck is essentially the roll bar. So these guys, larger-than-life characters, they start to fade away. So you have the changing, the internationalizing of talent, more polished drivers, drivers that are more concerned about their fitness. They're not smoking cigars, more concerned for safety. So I just want to interject this also because he passed away at Langhorne Speedway. But back to Langhorne today, that oval is now a strip mall. So this is something you're going to see across the country. When we look at lost tracks, they're no longer there because a strip mall came in, wiped it out, or a subdivision, and we see this all throughout the country. In this case, Catamount Stadium in Milton, Vermont, you can kind of see the legacy of that oval still there. Vermont, so not going to be a state in which you're going to see a large motorsport fan base. Also, you have the government regulation, definitely more of those what we think as green or environmentally conscious states. Further, it's not in a well-populated area. As this whole post-World War II boom happened, most of the population was growing in the southern or western parts of the United States. They weren't growing in New England, so the population base was also leaving this area. So this kind of makes sense why Catamount Stadium, this place that did have a good amount of NASCAR racing back in the day, met its demise there in the 80s. Out in Denver, they had the Lakeside Speedway, which was there for 50 years, which eventually met its demise in 1988. What was its problem? Well, it was in a neighborhood area, and so development definitely played a role. But once again, we have a bad situation. We have spectators being killed. Once again, the media is going to drive by and say, oh, motorsport, they're doing it for no reason. They're killing people for no reason. And so writing articles about it. And so the publicity did not help. And if you just quickly read this article here, you can see what met the demise was a spectator being killed at the venue. Here's the Continental Divide Raceway, a multi-purpose track that was a road course and also a drag strip, in which it was sold. So it was there for, several decades after the post-World War II boom, but in the 1980s, it met its demise for the plan for development. So here we have a recent photo. How's that development coming along? So since 1983, not much development been happening here, but the track was closed for so-called development. And of course, I could go on and on looking at aerial photos of lost tracks, and there's actually become, a little niche area of racing which people actually study this. They write books about it. They try to find them. They try to document them. So here is the Lost Speedways. They have a Facebook page. It's probably the most well-known, most active, in which they're trying to get tracks back on. Getting back going, but more just raising awareness about the plight of a lot of these tracks. And so there's been books by a former IUPUI professor, Pete Hilton, looking at ghost tracks, and there's so much demand, he wrote 2 books about them. And so another popular one called Speedway, written by Sam Collins, and even another one about lost road courses. So we're going to see this across the board. In Indiana, the Indianapolis Star did a great article on the Jungle Park Speedway and what led to its demise, and it's still faintly there on the landscape.